January 31st, 1968, Saigon, South Vietnam. The pre-dawn air hung thick with incense and cigarette smoke, mingling with the humid tropical atmosphere that clung to the city like a wet blanket. Red lanterns swayed gently from telephone wires, their paper surfaces decorated with golden dragons and traditional calligraphy, celebrating Tet, the Lunar New Year, Vietnam's most sacred holiday. The Year of the Monkey had arrived, bringing with it promises of renewal, prosperity, and peace. In the American compound near Tan Son Nhut Air Base, soldiers sipped lukewarm coffee from steel cups and wrote letters home by the light of kerosene lamps. The temporary ceasefire announced days earlier had created an unusual calm across South Vietnam. For the first time in months, the distant rumble of artillery had fallen silent. Helicopter rotors that normally chopped through the night air every few minutes now rested on landing pads, their blades drooping like exhausted metal wings. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez of the 1st Infantry Division folded a letter to his wife in San Antonio and tucked it into his breast pocket. Around him, other soldiers cleaned their M16 rifles with practiced efficiency, the metallic clicking of disassembled parts creating a familiar rhythm. The temporary peace felt strange, almost unnatural after months of constant vigilance. Even the jungle seemed quieter, as if the entire country had agreed to pause and breathe. But in the shadows of Saigon's narrow alleyways, different preparations were underway. Wooden crates marked as ceremonial offerings sat in Buddhist temples, their contents hidden beneath layers of incense sticks and prayer papers. The sweet smell of traditional holiday foods drifted from family kitchens, masking the acrid scent of gunpowder and plastic explosives. Motorcycles moved quietly through side streets, their riders wearing the simple clothes of holiday celebrants, their cargo compartments filled with AK-47 assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. The intelligence reports flowing into the Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters painted a picture of enemy exhaustion. General William Westmoreland's staff officers reviewed intercepts of North Vietnamese radio traffic, noting the unusual silence from Hanoi's command structure. The assessment was unanimous. The Communist forces were too weakened by recent operations to mount any significant offensive during the holiday period. The Viet Cong infrastructure, according to CIA estimates, had been severely damaged by months of search-and-destroy missions and Phoenix program operations. Colonel James Harrison, intelligence chief for 2 Corps, reviewed the day's briefing materials in his air-conditioned office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across maps dotted with red pins marking known enemy positions. His assessment memo, classified secret and distributed to field commanders throughout South Vietnam, concluded that any significant enemy action during Tet was highly unlikely. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong, the report stated, lacked the logistical capability and manpower reserves necessary for coordinated attacks during the holiday ceasefire. This confidence extended to the highest levels of American command. In Washington, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's office received daily situation reports emphasizing the military progress achieved throughout 1967. The metrics were encouraging. Enemy body counts, captured weapons, territory secured. The statistical war looked winnable. President Lyndon Johnson's advisors spoke of light at the end of the tunnel, of turning points and imminent victory. The American public, war-weary after 3 years of escalating involvement, heard promises of reduced troop deployments and negotiated settlements. What the intelligence analysts failed to detect was the most audacious military deception in modern warfare. For months, North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap had orchestrated a massive infiltration operation that moved 84,000 communist fighters into position throughout South Vietnam. The operation, codenamed Tong Tien Kong Va Noi Day, General Offensive and General Uprising, represented the largest coordinated attack in the Vietnam War. The logistical achievement was staggering in its complexity and scope. Weapons and ammunition moved south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail hidden in funeral processions, the wooden coffins containing rocket launchers instead of bodies. Traditional Tet gift baskets carried hand grenades disguised as ceremonial fruits. Medical supplies and rice rations were concealed in temple storage rooms, donated by sympathetic villagers who believed they were supporting legitimate religious activities. The entire operation relied on a network of civilian supporters that had taken years to establish and maintain. Radio intercepts that American intelligence officers dismissed as propaganda transmissions were actually coded movement orders. Seemingly routine broadcasts about weather conditions and agricultural reports contained precise timing instructions for coordinated attacks across more than 100 cities and towns. The communication system operated beneath the threshold of American detection, using low-power transmitters and frequency-hopping techniques that avoided the sophisticated electronic surveillance systems deployed throughout South Vietnam. The strategic objective transcended mere military victory. General Giap understood that the war's outcome would be determined not on the battlefields of Vietnam, but in the living rooms of America. Television had transformed modern warfare into a psychological contest where images carried more weight than casualty statistics. A dramatic, highly visible attack during a religious holiday would shatter American confidence in military progress reports and expose the vulnerability of supposedly secure urban areas. The plan required perfect timing and coordination across a 1,000-mile front. From the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south, communist forces would strike simultaneously at precisely 3:00 a.m. when defender alertness reached its lowest point, and when American television networks would broadcast the attacks during prime viewing hours in the United States. The psychological impact would be amplified by the timing, an assault on peace itself during Vietnam's most sacred holiday. At 2:47 a.m. on January 31, 1968, the illusion of peace shattered like glass, struck by a hammer. The first explosions erupted simultaneously across Saigon, their orange flames reflecting off puddles left by the evening rain. Automatic weapons fire crackled through the humid air as 19 Viet Cong sappers blasted a hole through the perimeter wall of the United States Embassy compound. The fortress-like building, completed just months earlier at a cost of $2.6 million, had been designed to symbolize American permanence and security in South Vietnam. Its reinforced concrete walls and bulletproof glass represented the technological superiority that supposedly guaranteed victory. Marine Security Guard Sergeant Ronald Harper was manning the embassy's main entrance when the attack began. The 22-year-old from Ohio had been writing in his diary, recording his observations about Tet celebrations he had witnessed earlier that evening. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the embassy wall 15 feet from his position, the blast wave throwing him into a concrete column and filling his ears with a high-pitched ringing that would persist for weeks. The attackers moved with practiced precision, their assault coordinated down to the second. Bangalore torpedoes blasted additional holes in the embassy perimeter, while automatic weapons fire suppressed response from Marine guards positioned in the upper floors. The Viet Cong fighters wore black pajamas and rubber sandals, carrying American-made weapons captured in previous battles. Their leader, Bay Thuyen, had studied architectural plans of the embassy compound for months, memorizing every entrance, exit, and defensive position. Inside the embassy building, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker's residence remained secure behind armored doors, but the psychological impact of the attack reverberated far beyond Saigon. Television cameras arrived within hours, broadcasting images that contradicted every optimistic assessment of the war's progress. Americans watching the morning news saw their embassy under siege, their flag surrounded by enemy fire, their technological superiority challenged by teenagers in sandals. The attack on the embassy represented only a fraction of the coordinated offensive unfolding across South Vietnam. In Hue, the ancient imperial capital, North Vietnamese army regulars seized key buildings and raised their flag over the citadel, the 1,000-year-old fortress that had served as the seat of Vietnamese emperors. The symbolic significance was unmistakable. The communists were claiming not just military victory, but cultural and historical legitimacy. Captain James Mueller of the 1st Cavalry Division received emergency deployment orders while shaving in his quarters at Camp Evans, 20 miles north of Hue. The radio crackled with confused reports of enemy forces inside the city, attacking government buildings and ARVN headquarters. The intelligence estimates that had predicted enemy exhaustion and incapability now seemed like products of wishful thinking rather than analytical rigor. The helicopter assault into Hue revealed the scope of communist preparation and coordination. UH-1D Huey helicopters carrying the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions throughout the city. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades that normally intimidated enemy forces now attracted streams of tracer rounds from multiple directions. Door gunners returned fire with M60 machine guns, their brass cartridges cascading onto rice paddies below. But the volume of ground fire indicated an enemy force far larger than intelligence estimates had suggested. Major Robert Thompson, piloting a Huey gunship, observed muzzle flashes from dozens of buildings as his aircraft approached the landing zone near Hugh University. The enemy had transformed the city into a fortress, with fighting positions prepared in advance and fields of fire carefully calculated. This was not the desperate last stand of a defeated insurgency, but the methodical execution of a carefully planned military operation. The urban warfare that followed challenged every assumption about American military superiority in Vietnam. The technological advantages that proved decisive in jungle warfare, helicopter mobility, artillery fire support, airstrikes, became liabilities in densely populated areas where civilian casualties would generate international condemnation. House-to-house fighting favored defenders who knew every alley and rooftop, who could move through tunnels and sewers invisible to American surveillance systems. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment advanced through Hue block by block, encountering resistance from North Vietnamese Army regulars armed with AK-47 assault rifles, B-40 rocket launchers, and 82mm mortars. The enemy fought from reinforced positions in concrete buildings, forcing Marines to use bazookas and recoilless rifles to blast through walls. The ancient city, with its temples and palaces that had survived centuries of conflict, began to crumble under the weight of modern warfare. The fighting in Hue continued for 26 days, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest urban battles of the Vietnam War. Every street became contested territory, every building a potential fortress. The Perfume River, which had given the city its romantic reputation, filled with bodies and debris. Artillery shells cratered roads that had been walked by Vietnamese emperors. Machine gun bullets chipped ancient stone carvings that had recorded 1,000 years of history. But the physical destruction paled compared to the human cost. North Vietnamese political officers executed thousands of civilians suspected of collaboration with the South Vietnamese government. Teachers, civil servants, and religious leaders disappeared into mass graves discovered weeks later in the nearby jungle. The communist forces had prepared lists of targets in advance, systematically eliminating individuals they considered enemies of the revolution. The Tet Offensive revealed the war's true nature, not a limited conflict that could be won through superior firepower and technology, but a total struggle for the political soul of Vietnam. The communist forces understood that victory required the destruction of South Vietnam's government infrastructure and the elimination of anyone who might rebuild it. The holiday ceasefire had been used not for rest and celebration, but for positioning executioners. American television coverage of the Tet Offensive transformed public perception of the war more dramatically than any military defeat could have achieved. CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite arrived in Saigon as the battles raged, his camera crews documenting the gap between official optimism and visible reality. The images broadcast into American homes showed Marines fighting for survival in embassy hallways, helicopters evacuating wounded from rooftops, and cities burning despite years of promises about imminent victory. The psychological impact extended beyond public opinion to affect the men fighting the war. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had felt confident about the ceasefire just hours earlier, now questioned every intelligence briefing and progress report he had received. If the enemy could mount coordinated attacks on more than 100 targets simultaneously, how accurate were the estimates of their weakness and demoralization? The helicopter crews who had dominated Vietnam's battlefields for years discovered new vulnerabilities during the urban fighting. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female pilots in Vietnam, flew medical evacuation missions into Saigon and Hue throughout the offensive. Her UH-1 Huey absorbed dozens of bullet holes during missions that required landing in streets swept by enemy fire. The aircraft's turbine engine, designed for jungle warfare, where mechanical reliability mattered more than armor protection, proved fragile when exposed to concentrated small arms fire from multiple directions. Mitchell's logbook recorded a typical day during the offensive. 7 evacuation missions, 43 wounded soldiers transported, 2 emergency landings due to battle damage, engine replacement required. The mathematics of attrition warfare suddenly looked different when American technology faced coordinated resistance rather than scattered guerrilla attacks. Each helicopter represented millions of dollars in development and manufacturing costs, years of pilot training, complex maintenance requirements. The enemy's ability to destroy these assets using weapons costing hundreds of dollars challenged fundamental assumptions about military economics. The fuel logistics alone revealed American vulnerabilities that communist planners had identified and exploited. Every Huey required aviation fuel that had to be shipped from the United States, refined to precise specifications, transported to forward bases, and stored in facilities vulnerable to rocket and mortar attack. The helicopter's range and payload decreased significantly in hot weather, limiting its effectiveness during the dry season when most military operations occurred. Weather reconnaissance flights reported atmospheric conditions that further complicated American operations during Tet. The monsoon season had ended, but humidity remained above 90%, causing electronics failures in radio equipment and reducing visibility for pilots and ground forces. Temperature inversions trapped smoke from burning buildings close to the ground, creating a fog of war that favored defenders familiar with local terrain over attackers dependent on technological surveillance systems. The radar installations that provided early warning of enemy aircraft proved useless against an enemy that moved on foot and attacked from within secured areas. The sophisticated electronic warfare systems designed to intercept radio communications could not decode face-to-face conversations between communist commanders who had planned their operations months in advance. The computer systems that processed intelligence reports and generated optimistic assessments had been programmed with assumptions that the Tet offensive proved catastrophically wrong. Supply chain management, normally invisible to combat troops, became a critical factor as battles extended beyond initial projections. Ammunition consumption rates during urban fighting exceeded peacetime planning estimates by factors of 3 to 5. Medical supplies designed for treating jungle warfare casualties proved inadequate for the traumatic injuries caused by rocket-propelled grenades and improvised explosive devices in confined spaces. Even basic necessities like food and water became problematic when enemy forces controlled the roads and markets that normally supplied American bases. The engineering challenges of fighting in cities required innovations that military doctrine had not anticipated. Bulldozers originally intended for jungle clearing operations were modified with armor plating to breach walls and create firing positions. Communications equipment designed for open terrain failed to penetrate the concrete buildings that dominated urban landscapes. Navigation systems that worked perfectly in rice paddies became unreliable among tall buildings that blocked satellite signals and created radio shadow zones. But perhaps the greatest engineering failure involved human factors that no technology could address. American soldiers trained for conventional warfare in European scenarios found themselves fighting an enemy that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, that used children and elderly civilians as scouts and ammunition carriers, that had no mechanized equipment to target with precision weapon systems. The rules of engagement that made sense in conventional battles became moral puzzles that individual soldiers had to solve within seconds while under direct fire. The medical evacuation system had saved thousands of American lives during earlier phases, struggled to function in urban environments where landings came under immediate attack. Dust-off helicopters, identified by their Red Cross markings, discovered that international law meant nothing to enemy forces that viewed the conflict as total war. Medical personnel carrying wounded soldiers through burning cities became targets rather than protected non-combatants. Artillery fire support, the backbone of American tactical doctrine, became problematic when enemy positions were intermixed with civilian populations. Forward observers trained to call in devastating barrages against jungle targets now had to consider the political consequences of destroying hospitals, schools, and religious sites. The mathematical precision that made artillery effective in unpopulated areas became a liability when every targeting decision carried implications for international opinion and domestic support. Air support faced similar constraints, multiplied by the visibility of aircraft operating over population centers. Fighter bombers that could attack enemy positions in remote areas with impunity now operated under the scrutiny of television cameras and newspaper photographers. Napalm and white phosphorus, effective against jungle positions, created images that undermined public support for the war when used in cities filled with non-combatants. The communication systems that coordinated these complex operations revealed another dimension of American vulnerability. Radio frequencies that had been secure for months were suddenly jammed or intercepted. Code words that had protected operational security were compromised by enemy intelligence networks that had been monitoring American communications for years. The sophisticated encryption systems installed at great expense proved vulnerable to enemy forces that had obtained American equipment through captured installations and defected personnel. Command and control systems designed for conventional military operations broke down when confronted with simultaneous attacks across multiple provinces. Telephone networks that connected headquarters with field units were cut by enemy sappers who had studied infrastructure vulnerabilities as carefully as military targets. The centralized command structure that enabled rapid deployment and coordination became a weakness when communication links failed and local commanders had to make decisions without guidance from higher headquarters. The intelligence failures that enabled the Tet Offensive revealed systematic problems with American understanding of Vietnamese society and communist capabilities. The human intelligence networks that provided information about enemy intentions were compromised by double agents who fed false information to American handlers while providing accurate intelligence to communist commanders. The technological surveillance systems that monitored radio transmissions and photographed suspected enemy positions could not penetrate the face-to-face communication networks that coordinated the offensive. Cultural intelligence proved even more inadequate. American analysts who understood the religious significance of Tet failed to recognize that this spiritual importance made the holiday an ideal time for an attack that would maximize psychological impact. The communist forces understood that violating the sacred nature of Tet would shock Vietnamese society while demonstrating their commitment to revolutionary war that transcended traditional values. The linguistic barriers that had complicated American operations throughout the war became critical during urban fighting, where success depended on communication with civilian populations. Interpreters who could translate military terminology often lacked the cultural knowledge necessary to understand why civilians might hide enemy fighters or provide false information to American forces. The assumption that technology could overcome language barriers proved false when victory required understanding the political motivations of individual Vietnamese families. Economic intelligence revealed another dimension of American miscalculation. The cost analysis that justified continued military operations assumed that communist forces were reaching the limits of their financial and material resources. But the Tet Offensive demonstrated that enemy forces had been stockpiling weapons and supplies for months, suggesting access to resources far greater than American estimates indicated. The economic war that supposedly favored American industrial capacity was being won by an enemy that required minimal infrastructure and external support. The psychological warfare dimension of Tet exposed American vulnerabilities that extended far beyond Vietnam. Communist propagandists understood that American public opinion would be shaped primarily by television images rather than casualty statistics or territory controlled. The timing of attacks to coincide with peak television viewing hours in the United States showed sophisticated understanding of American media cycles and political processes. The attacks themselves were designed for visual impact rather than military effectiveness. The assault on the American embassy, while militarily insignificant, created images that undermined confidence in American security guarantees. The battles in ancient cities like Hue generated footage that contrasted American firepower with Vietnamese cultural heritage, suggesting that American forces were destroying what they claimed to be protecting. Television correspondents who had generally supported American objectives found themselves reporting from burning cities where official optimism appeared disconnected from visible reality. The credibility gap that had been growing for months suddenly became undeniable when viewers could see enemy forces attacking targets that American officials had declared secure. The war that had been fought largely in remote jungle areas was suddenly visible in living rooms across America. Walter Cronkite's February 27th editorial following his visit to Vietnam crystallized the shift in public perception. The most trusted journalist in America concluded that the war was destined to end in stalemate, directly contradicting official assessments of progress and success. His words carried weight that no government spokesman could match. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. President Johnson's reaction to Cronkite's broadcast revealed the political significance of the psychological victory communist forces had achieved. "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America," Johnson reportedly told his press secretary George Christian. The president who had escalated American involvement in Vietnam, based on confidence in military superiority, now faced the collapse of public support for continued operations. The strategic implications extended beyond American domestic politics to affect relationships with allies and neutral nations. The Tet Offensive demonstrated that American forces, despite their technological advantages and massive resource commitments, could not prevent coordinated enemy attacks on population centers throughout South Vietnam. This reality undermined American credibility in other conflicts where military intervention was being considered or implemented. The tactical lessons learned during Tet influenced American military doctrine for decades. Urban warfare, previously considered a specialized skill required only in limited circumstances, became a core competency that required extensive training and equipment modifications. The assumption that advanced technology could substitute for cultural knowledge and political understanding was challenged by an enemy that turned these advantages into liabilities. The human cost of the offensive extended far beyond casualty statistics to include psychological trauma that affected individuals for the rest of their lives. Soldiers who had believed in their mission and their leaders' assessments discovered that much of what they had been told was either wrong or deliberately misleading. The cognitive dissonance between official explanations and personal experience created psychological wounds that proved as lasting as physical injuries. Medical personnel reported treating cases of combat stress reaction at rates unprecedented in American military experience. The urban fighting that characterized much of Tet created conditions that psychiatric doctrine had not anticipated. Prolonged exposure to civilian casualties, moral ambiguity about targeting decisions, and the constant threat of attack from any direction. Traditional concepts of shell shock and battle fatigue proved inadequate to describe the psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy in populated areas. The logistics of treating wounded personnel during extended urban battles revealed additional vulnerabilities in American medical doctrine. Field hospitals designed for conventional warfare could not cope with the volume and types of injuries generated by rocket-propelled grenades and improvised explosive devices in confined spaces. The medical evacuation system that had functioned effectively in jungle warfare broke down when landing zones were continuously under fire, and ground transportation was blocked by rubble and enemy positions. Supply lines that had maintained American forces in remote jungle bases proved vulnerable to attack by enemy forces operating inside supposedly secure cities. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and food storage facilities became targets for enemy sappers who could approach undetected among civilian populations. The logistics network that supported American operations required extensive modifications to function in urban environments where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had become meaningless. The engineering solutions developed during Tet influenced military procurement and training programs for years afterward. Armored vehicles designed for jungle warfare were modified with additional protection against rocket-propelled grenades and improved vision systems for urban operations. Communication equipment was redesigned to function reliably in built-up areas where radio transmission was blocked or distorted by buildings and infrastructure. But the most significant changes involved doctrine and training rather than equipment. The assumptions that had guided American strategy in Vietnam, that superior firepower and mobility would eventually wear down enemy resistance, that technological advantages would compensate for limited cultural knowledge, that military victory was possible without addressing underlying political issues, were fundamentally challenged by the Tet Offensive. The aftermath of Tet revealed the full scope of intelligence failures that had enabled the offensive. Post-attack analysis showed that warning signs had been available for months, but were misinterpreted or dismissed by analysts who preferred information that confirmed existing assessments rather than data that challenged fundamental assumptions. The human intelligence networks that should have detected large-scale enemy preparations had been compromised or simply ignored. Communication intercepts that had been dismissed as enemy propaganda were revealed to contain coded operational orders for the coordinated attacks. Signal intelligence analysts who focused on technical aspects of enemy transmissions had missed the political and psychological dimensions that gave meaning to seemingly routine broadcasts. The compartmentalized intelligence system that prevented lower-level analysts from seeing the complete picture had enabled enemy deception operations that might have been detected by personnel with broader access to available information. The lessons of Tet extended beyond military tactics to influence American understanding of limited war and political objectives. The assumption that military means could achieve political ends without addressing the underlying causes of conflict was challenged by an enemy that understood the relationship between military action and psychological impact. The communist forces had achieved their strategic objective, undermining American public support for the war, despite suffering devastating tactical defeats in conventional military terms. The economic analysis of Tet revealed the unsustainable nature of American strategy in Vietnam. The cost of maintaining technological superiority against an enemy that required minimal infrastructure and external support created resource drains that affected other American commitments worldwide. The helicopter operations alone consumed fuel, spare parts, and maintenance personnel at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely without affecting military readiness in other theaters. The political implications of these economic realities became apparent as Congress began questioning military spending requests and demanding more realistic assessments of progress in Vietnam. The credibility gap that opened during Tet extended to military budget justifications and procurement programs that had previously received automatic approval. The war that had been sold to the American public as a limited commitment requiring minimal sacrifice was revealed as an open-ended resource drain with no clear victory conditions. The international dimensions of the Tet Offensive affected American relationships with allies who had supported intervention in Vietnam based on confidence in American military capabilities. The inability to prevent coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam, despite years of military buildup and billions of dollars in expenditures, raised questions about American reliability in other potential conflicts. Allied governments that had contributed forces to Vietnam began reconsidering their commitments based on the evidence of American strategic confusion. The media coverage of Tet established precedents for television reporting of military conflicts that influenced American foreign policy for decades. The visual impact of combat footage broadcast into American homes created political constraints on military operations that had not existed during previous wars. The assumption that public support could be maintained through official briefings and controlled information became obsolete when television cameras provided unfiltered images of military setbacks and civilian casualties. The technological lessons of Tet influenced military research and development programs that emphasized survivability and reliability over raw performance. The helicopter designs that emerged from Vietnam incorporated armor protection and redundant systems that reflected lessons learned during urban combat operations. Communication equipment was redesigned to function reliably in electronic warfare environments where enemy forces could intercept or jam American transmissions. But perhaps the most important lesson involved the limitations of technological solutions to political problems. The communist forces that mounted the Tet Offensive succeeded through careful planning, thorough preparation, and accurate understanding of American vulnerabilities rather than technological superiority. Their weapons were often inferior to American equipment, but their strategy was superior to American doctrine. The human dimension of this strategic reality became apparent in individual stories from the offensive. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had felt confident about military progress just hours before Tet began, spent months afterward questioning not just intelligence reports, but his own understanding of what the war was supposed to achieve. The letters he wrote home after January 31, 1968, reflected confusion and doubt that had replaced earlier optimism about American objectives in Vietnam. Captain Mitchell's medical evacuation missions during Tet exposed her to casualties that challenged her faith in American strategy. The wounded soldiers she transported from urban battle zones were evidence of an enemy capability that contradicted every briefing she had received about communist weakness and demoralization. The helicopter that had been her tool for saving lives became a symbol of American vulnerability when it repeatedly came under fire from enemy positions that intelligence reports claimed did not exist. The moral complexity of fighting in populated areas created ethical dilemmas that individual soldiers had to resolve without guidance from military doctrine or rules of engagement. The decision to return fire when enemy positions were located in hospitals or schools The choice to trust information provided by Vietnamese civilians who might be enemy sympathizers. The judgment about whether fleeing figures were non-combatants or escaping fighters. These decisions required moral reasoning that military training had not provided. The aftermath of urban battles revealed civilian casualties that contradicted American claims about precision warfare and surgical strikes. The families killed by artillery fire aimed at enemy positions, the children wounded by helicopter gunships targeting suspected communist fighters, the elderly people executed by both sides on suspicion of collaboration. These human costs of the urban warfare that characterized Tet created moral burdens that affected American personnel for decades. The medical personnel who treated civilian casualties during Tet faced ethical dilemmas that medical training had not anticipated. The resources devoted to treating American wounded could not be used for Vietnamese civilians whose injuries were equally severe, but whose treatment was not required by military regulations. The moral weight of these decisions created psychological stress that proved as lasting as exposure to direct combat. The reconstruction efforts that followed the urban battles revealed the complexity of nation-building in a war zone where the distinction between friend and enemy remained unclear. Engineers who rebuilt destroyed infrastructure could not determine whether their work would benefit legitimate government operations or provide resources for continued enemy activities. The schools, hospitals, and government buildings reconstructed with American funds might be used by the same local officials who had provided intelligence to communist forces during Tet. The intelligence assessment process that had failed so dramatically during Tet underwent systematic review that revealed fundamental problems with American understanding of Vietnamese society. The cultural assumptions that led analysts to dismiss the possibility of attacks during a religious holiday reflected broader ignorance about Vietnamese values and communist strategy. The reliance on technological surveillance systems had reduced human intelligence capabilities that might have detected enemy preparations for coordinated attacks. The communication patterns between American headquarters and field units revealed another dimension of the intelligence failure. Information that contradicted official assessments was often dismissed or delayed in transmission to higher command levels. Field commanders who reported evidence of unusual enemy activity were told that their concerns were inconsistent with intelligence estimates based on more reliable sources. The institutional pressure to provide optimistic assessments prevented accurate information from reaching decision-makers who might have recognized the warning signs of impending attack. The aftermath analysis revealed that successful intelligence operations require not just technical capabilities, but cultural knowledge and linguistic skills that cannot be easily acquired or quickly developed. The American intelligence community had invested heavily in electronic surveillance and signal intercepts while neglecting human intelligence networks that could have provided insights into enemy intentions and capabilities. The assumption that technology could substitute for cultural understanding proved false when enemy forces used these limitations to achieve strategic surprise. The strategic communication aspects of Tet demonstrated communist understanding of American political processes and media systems that exceeded American knowledge of Vietnamese society. The timing of attacks to coincide with American television schedules, the selection of targets for maximum visual impact, the coordination of military action with propaganda themes. These elements showed sophisticated analysis of American vulnerabilities that American intelligence had not anticipated. The psychological operations conducted by both sides during Tet revealed the importance of information warfare in modern conflicts. Communist forces succeeded in portraying their attacks as evidence of popular support for revolution, even though post-battle analysis showed minimal civilian participation in anti-government activities. American psychological operations, designed to emphasize battlefield victories and enemy casualties, failed to address the fundamental question raised by Tet. If American forces were winning, why could enemy forces mount coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam? The long-term implications of these psychological victories became apparent in American domestic politics as support for continued military involvement declined steadily after Tet. The credibility gap that opened between official assessments and television coverage could not be closed by improved public relations or more sophisticated information management. The visual evidence of American vulnerability that was broadcast during Tet created lasting doubts about military effectiveness that influenced American foreign policy decisions for decades. The strategic lessons of Tet extended beyond Vietnam to affect American military doctrine and training programs worldwide. The urban warfare techniques developed during the offensive influenced military planning for conflicts in other regions, where population centers might become battlefields. The integration of psychological operations with conventional military tactics became a standard element of strategic planning that reflected lessons learned during the most significant intelligence failure in American military history. The technological innovations that emerged from Tet experiences influenced military research and development priorities for decades. The communication systems that failed during urban combat were redesigned to function reliably in electronic warfare environments. The helicopter designs that proved vulnerable to concentrated small arms fire were modified with improved armor and defensive systems. The medical equipment that could not cope with urban battlefield casualties was redesigned for mass casualty situations involving complex trauma cases. But the human lessons of Tet proved more difficult to incorporate into institutional memory and military doctrine. The psychological stress experienced by personnel who discovered that their understanding of the conflict was fundamentally flawed could not be addressed through equipment modifications or training programs. The moral complexity of fighting an enemy that used civilian populations for cover and support created ethical dilemmas that military education had not anticipated and could not easily resolve. The financial cost of maintaining American forces in Vietnam after Tet required budget commitments that affected military readiness in other regions and domestic spending priorities that influenced American politics for years. The assumption that superior resources would eventually guarantee victory was challenged by an enemy that achieved strategic objectives while suffering devastating tactical defeats. The economic sustainability of limited war became a political issue that influenced American strategic thinking about future interventions. The international implications of American performance during Tet affected alliance relationships and deterrence calculations that extended far beyond Southeast Asia. The inability to prevent coordinated enemy attacks despite overwhelming technological and resource advantages raised questions about American military effectiveness that influenced Soviet strategic planning and Chinese assessments of American resolve. The credibility that had been built through decades of successful deterrence was damaged by televised images of American forces fighting for survival in embassy compounds and evacuating wounded from rooftops. Today, more than 5 decades after the Tet Offensive, military historians and strategic analysts continue to study the lessons of those terrible days when the promise of peace became a prelude to the most intensive fighting of the Vietnam War. The intelligence failures that enabled enemy strategic surprise, the communication breakdowns that prevented effective coordination of defensive operations, the cultural misunderstandings that led to systematic underestimation of enemy capabilities, these elements combined to create one of the most significant military surprises in American history. The men and women who served during Tet, helicopter pilots like Captain Mitchell who flew medical evacuation missions under fire, infantry soldiers like Sergeant Rodriguez who discovered that official assessments bore little resemblance to battlefield reality, intelligence analysts who struggled to understand why their estimates proved catastrophically wrong. These individuals carried the burden of strategic failure that extended far beyond their personal responsibility or professional capabilities. The enemy forces that mounted the Tet Offensive demonstrated that careful planning, accurate intelligence, and realistic assessment of opponent weaknesses could overcome vast disparities in resources and technology. Their success was measured not in territory captured or enemy forces destroyed, but in psychological impact achieved and political objectives accomplished. They understood that the war would ultimately be decided not on the battlefields of Vietnam, but in the minds of the American people. The legacy of Tet continues to influence American strategic thinking about military intervention, intelligence assessment, and the relationship between military means and political objectives. The assumption that technological superiority guarantees military success was challenged by an enemy that turned American advantages into vulnerabilities through superior strategy and more accurate understanding of the political dimensions of conflict. The television images broadcast from burning cities during those 36 days in early 1968 created lasting memories that shaped American attitudes toward military intervention for decades. The gap between official optimism and visible reality that was exposed during Tet established precedents for media coverage of military operations that continue to influence American foreign policy decisions today. The human cost of the intelligence failures and strategic miscalculations that enabled Tet extended far beyond casualty statistics to include psychological trauma that affected thousands of individuals for the rest of their lives. The soldiers who discovered that their understanding of the war was fundamentally flawed, the intelligence analysts whose assessments proved dangerously wrong, the political leaders whose confidence in military progress was shattered by televised images of American vulnerability. These personal costs of strategic failure remind us that the consequences of military decisions extend far beyond immediate battlefield results. The Tet Offensive of 1968 stands as a watershed moment in American military history, when the illusion of inevitable victory collided with the reality of strategic surprise and tactical flexibility that superior resources could not overcome. It reminds us that in warfare, as in life, the most dangerous assumptions are those that remain unexamined, and the most costly failures are those that stem from refusing to acknowledge what we do not understand about our enemies and ourselves. The jungle has long since reclaimed the landing zones where helicopters brought wounded soldiers during those terrible days. The cities that burned during Tet have been rebuilt, their scars hidden beneath decades of peace and prosperity. But the lessons of those 36 days when the promise of peace became a preview of intensified war remain relevant for anyone who seeks to understand the complex relationship between military power and political outcomes in the modern world. Do we truly comprehend the lessons that those men and women paid for with their blood, their sanity, and their faith in the institutions they served? Have we learned to question the assumptions that led to such comprehensive intelligence failure? Or do we continue to mistake technological superiority for strategic wisdom? Their sacrifice demands that we remember not just their courage under fire, but the systematic failures that put them in impossible positions and asked them to achieve political objectives through military means without providing the cultural knowledge and intelligence accuracy necessary for success. If this story has moved you to reflection about the complexity of modern warfare and the human cost of strategic miscalculation, please share it with others who seek to understand how good people can find themselves trapped in impossible situations by the failures of the institutions they serve. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss the continuing stories of courage, sacrifice, and hard-learned wisdom from America's longest and most complex war. Their memories deserve to be preserved, their lessons remembered, and their sacrifice honored by those who refuse to forget the price of strategic failure and the cost of unexamined assumptions about military power and political objectives.